The atmosphere in Washington, D.C. had been increasingly charged. The Senate was abuzz with whispers about a brewing conflict between two women, Tulsi Gabbard, the former congresswoman and rising star in the political landscape, and Kamala Harris, the Vice President of the United States. Both had once been part of the Democratic establishment, but their paths had diverged significantly. It all began with a speech Kamala Harris gave in front of the National Women's Leadership Summit, where she fiercely defended her record on criminal justice reform. She spoke of a tough-on-crime policy as a badge of honor, positioning herself as a defender of the rights of women and minorities. It was a bold claim, one that earned applause from the crowd but also raised eyebrows. Tulsi Gabbard, ever the critic of establishment politics, was not impressed. She had spent years pushing for a real transformation of the justice system, one that didn't rely on tough rhetoric or punitive policies. And when Kamala made those remarks, Gabbard saw a glaring contradiction. After all, Kamala Harris had been the district attorney of San Francisco, where her office had been accused of being too harsh on minor drug offenses, disproportionately impacting communities of color. In fact, Tulsi had called out Harris's record during the 2020 Democratic primaries, accusing her of hypocrisy for portraying herself as a progressive while supporting policies that had only worsened the problems she now claimed to fight against. Now, it seemed, the time had come for Gabbard to call Harris out once more. Tulsi Gabbard's fingers flew across her phone screen as she composed her response. The tweet was short, sharp, and packed a punch. Kamala Harris claims to stand for justice, but where was that justice when she locked up thousands of nonviolent offenders for minor drug crimes? It's time for some real accountability. She hit send. Almost immediately, her phone started buzzing with notifications, retweets, likes, and, of course, the backlash. Supporters of Kamala Harris rushed to defend her, claiming that Gabbard was misinterpreting the situation or that it was all in the past. But Tulsi's words had already struck a chord. The tweet went viral, catching the attention of political commentators across the nation. The media outlets couldn't get enough of the sudden clash between the two former Democratic heavyweights. Many pundits on both sides of the political spectrum saw this as more than just a personal feud, it was an ideological battle. Gabbard's call for accountability seemed to challenge Harris's carefully curated image of progressivism. Kamala Harris, no stranger to controversy, quickly responded. In a press conference the following day, she brushed off Gabbard's critique, calling it unfortunate and misleading. "I stand by my record," Harris said firmly. "I've worked tirelessly to improve the system, and the reality is, some tough decisions were necessary in the fight against crime. Sometimes you have to make hard choices to protect your community." But that didn't quiet the growing storm. If anything, her defense only fanned the flames. Tulsi's supporters began to point out the glaring contradictions in Harris's rhetoric. How could she claim to champion criminal justice reform while defending the very policies that had perpetuated systemic injustice for years? The tension between Tulsi Gabbard and Kamala Harris was escalating, and the media couldn't get enough of it. The two women had become symbolic of the larger ideological divide within the Democratic Party. Gabbard, a staunch anti-war advocate and critic of establishment policies, was positioning herself as a voice of reason against the party's more mainstream leadership. Harris, on the other hand, embodied the party's establishment and the political strategies it had relied on for decades. As the days passed, Gabbard's challenge to Harris's record gained traction. A political debate was set between the two, something neither had ever publicly agreed to before. The stage was set for an unforgettable confrontation. The night of the debate arrived, and the auditorium was packed with journalists, political insiders, and supporters of both women. The moderators were careful to keep things civil, but the air was thick with anticipation. Gabbard took to the stage first, her demeanor calm but intense, while Harris stood poised with her characteristic confidence. The debate began with a series of questions on the economy and foreign policy, areas where both women had well-established positions. But when the subject turned to criminal justice, the mood shifted dramatically. Harris was the first to speak, defending her tenure as the Attorney General of California, recounting her efforts to reduce recidivism rates, improve rehabilitation programs, and advocate for police reform. But Tulsi wasn't having it. She quickly interrupted. With all due respect, Vice President Harris, you can't claim to fight for the most vulnerable while defending policies that disproportionately impacted those very communities, Tulsi fired back. The audience shifted in their seats, sensing the tension. You locked up thousands of people for offenses that, in retrospect, we know should never have led to criminal charges in the first place. You've had years to rectify that, and yet here we are. Kamala's expression tightened. She countered, I've always believed in second chances, Tulsi. But let's not forget that we are talking about public safety here. These were decisions made to keep our communities safe, even if the outcomes weren't perfect. Tulsi was quick to respond, her voice steady but cutting. What you're describing, Kamala, isn't safety, it's control. The kind of control that leads to the over-incarceration of people of color and perpetuates cycles of poverty. If we're talking about reform, why are we still holding on to those very policies? The room fell silent. Even the moderators seemed taken aback by the sharpness of the exchange. Kamala's face hardened as she leaned forward. You don't know what it's like to make those decisions in the heat of the moment, Tulsi. You can sit here with your idealistic rhetoric, but sometimes you need tough policies to tackle real problems. Tulsi shook her head slightly, not backing down. I do know, Kamala. I know what it's like to fight for peace, to fight against the establishment, and to stand for those who've been left behind. Maybe it's time for a new approach. One that doesn't treat people like criminals before they even commit a crime. The crowd erupted into applause. The debate didn't just end when the microphones were turned off. The confrontation between Tulsi Gabbard and Kamala Harris had sparked a firestorm in the political world. The fallout was immediate and intense. In the days following the debate, news outlets from across the country were analyzing every word, every gesture, every moment of the exchange. For Tulsi, the response was overwhelmingly positive, particularly among those disillusioned with the Democratic establishment. Many saw her as the voice of reason, the one politician brave enough to take on Harris' tough-on-crime record and demand real change. On the other hand, Kamala Harris supporters were quick to rally around her. They claimed Tulsi's attack was a misguided attempt to undermine a leader who had worked tirelessly to implement meaningful reforms. The vice president's camp issued statements claiming Tulsi was out of touch with the complexities of public safety and criminal justice. But the real test came when the public weighed in. Tulsi's Twitter following exploded, her mentions flooded with praise from those who admired her courage and consistency. People from across the political spectrum, some even from the Republican side, admired the way she had taken on Harris with such conviction. They recognized her not just as a critic of Harris but as a fierce defender of the marginalized and the voiceless. Kamala Harris, meanwhile, faced a growing wave of questions from political analysts, journalists, and even members of her own party. Her defense of past decisions was becoming less convincing, and cracks began to form in her carefully crafted image as a progressive reformer. Critics pointed out that her rhetoric didn't match the reality of her record, and it seemed that, for the first time, she was being forced to reckon with the consequences of her own policies. The contrast between the two women had never been clearer. Gabbard was now being seen as the outsider, someone who was unafraid to challenge the status quo, while Harris's image as a pragmatic leader was starting to fray under the weight of her past decisions. Kamala, ever the politician, was determined not to let the controversy overshadow her plans. But in private, she knew the stakes had just been raised. The road ahead was no longer about simple policy debates, it was about public perception, legacy, and whether or not she could survive a challenge from someone like Tulsi Gabbard. As the weeks passed, the debate didn't die down. It had become clear that a larger political battle was brewing, a clash of ideals between the establishment and those willing to fight for real, transformative change. The days following the debate saw a rapid shift in the political landscape. Kamala Harris's campaign, once built on the foundation of unity and progressive ideals, was now embroiled in a struggle for its own survival. The scrutiny of her criminal justice record had ignited a firestorm of criticism from both within her own party and from the public at large. Tulsi Gabbard, on the other hand, had emerged as a surprising figure of strength. With each passing day, she found herself surrounded by an ever-growing base of supporters who saw her as the real alternative to the Democratic establishment. In interviews, she didn't shy away from calling out Kamala's record, but she also made it clear that she wasn't fighting for political theater. Her goal was a genuine, transformative overhaul of the political system, one that prioritized the well-being of people over political games. Kamala Harris' team began to panic. It wasn't just Tulsi's critiques that were starting to hurt, it was the mounting pressure to justify every decision she had ever made in her career. The vice president, who had long been seen as a rising star, was suddenly on the defensive, forced to explain herself at every turn. Her supporters started to dwindle, and her poll numbers dropped. Tulsi's team, by contrast, was riding a wave of momentum. They seized the opportunity, pushing for rallies, town halls, and appearances across the country. With every speech, Gabbard's message resonated more deeply with voters who were tired of empty promises and tired of being told that real change couldn't happen. The media painted her as the outsider, the true progressive, someone who had the courage to question the system. As Tulsi traveled across the country, she gave speeches about a future that didn't rely on fear or authoritarian policies but instead focused on empowerment, peace, and justice. She spoke out against war, corporate interests, and the failed drug policies that had decimated countless communities. In one town hall, Gabbard said, "You cannot claim to fight for justice if you are part of the system that perpetuates injustice. It's time for us to stand up and demand something better. The people who have been forgotten, the poor, the marginalized, the incarcerated, are not just statistics. They are real people, and they deserve more than empty rhetoric." Her words echoed throughout the room, and a wave of applause followed. The energy in the room was palpable. People believed in her. They trusted her. Meanwhile, Kamala Harris's campaign was forced to play defense, scrambling to secure support from her base while desperately trying to appeal to the progressive wing of the party. But the more she defended her record, the more it seemed like she was digging herself deeper into a hole. Her message began to ring hollow, as voters wondered if she was truly willing to change or if she was just trying to hold on to power. Kamala's attempts to pivot only seemed to backfire. In a moment of frustration during a press conference, she snapped, "I have worked my entire life to make this country a better place. I will not let anyone rewrite my history for the sake of political points." The statement felt more defensive than empowered, and it only served to make her appear out of touch with the concerns of the American people. In contrast, Tulsi continued to speak to the people, unencumbered by the baggage of years in office. She represented change, a departure from the old guard that had failed to deliver. The Democratic primary season was heating up. Harris, once considered the future of the party, now found herself struggling to stay relevant as Tulsi Gabbard became a symbol of revolt, a beacon for voters who were tired of the status quo. The Democratic primary race had officially begun, and it was shaping up to be far more contentious than anyone had anticipated. Tulsi Gabbard, once seen as a long shot, had become a powerful force in the party's reshuffling. With every rally, she gained more traction, slowly becoming the voice for those who were fed up with the old ways of politics. Kamala Harris, on the other hand, was feeling the pressure like never before. The media began to take a closer look at Tulsi's rise. Some pundits called it a revolution, while others dismissed it as a passing fad. But there was no denying the growing movement behind her. She wasn't just offering critiques, she was offering solutions, and people were listening. Kamala Harris knew the race was slipping away. Her internal polls were showing alarming trends. The more voters saw her clashing with Tulsi, the more they questioned her ability to lead the party in a time of deep division. In private meetings with her advisors, she expressed her frustration. "I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this," she said, rubbing her temples in a rare moment of vulnerability. "Every time I make a move, it feels like I'm digging myself deeper into a hole. Tulsi's right about one thing, my record isn't as perfect as I've been telling people." Her advisors urged her to stay strong, to continue pushing the message that she was a pragmatic leader who had always worked for the greater good. They suggested that she focus on unity and try to rebuild the narrative that had propelled her into office. But Tulsi was gaining ground faster than anyone could have predicted. Her unrelenting focus on criminal justice reform and anti-war policies was resonating not just with progressives, but also with moderates who were tired of the endless cycle of partisan bickering. In debates, she effortlessly tore into Harris's contradictions, and her calm, measured approach only made Harris look increasingly erratic. As the primaries drew closer, the Democratic establishment began to get nervous. There was real fear that Kamala Harris, once seen as the clear frontrunner, might lose the nomination to someone who had spent years outside the traditional political machine. Behind closed doors, some of the party's most powerful figures started to whisper about a potential shift in the party's direction. Kamala had tried to brand herself as the future of the Democratic Party, but now, it was clear that her vision was no longer the one that inspired hope in the masses. People were looking for someone who wasn't tied to the same system of power and influence. They wanted someone who wasn't afraid to challenge the establishment, someone who could offer a fresh perspective. The night of the Iowa caucuses arrived, and both candidates were on edge. The polls had narrowed to a razor-thin margin, with Tulsi slowly inching ahead. As results began to trickle in, it became apparent that the tide was turning. Tulsi Gabbard had done it, she had shocked the political world by winning Iowa. It wasn't a landslide, but it was enough to prove that the momentum was firmly in her court. The victory was more than just symbolic, it was a message to Kamala Harris and the rest of the Democratic establishment that change was not only possible, it was inevitable. Kamala's camp, stunned by the unexpected defeat, scrambled to put together a response. It was clear that they could no longer downplay Tulsi's rising star. They had underestimated her, and now they were paying the price. The aftermath of the Iowa caucus left Kamala Harris reeling. Her campaign, once built on optimism and the promise of a new kind of leadership, had just suffered a major blow. Tulsi Gabbard's victory was not just symbolic, it was a warning shot, signaling that the tides of politics were shifting in a direction Harris had not anticipated. The establishment, which had once rallied around her, now appeared fragmented and uncertain. Kamala's advisors convened in a series of tense strategy meetings. There was an air of panic as they discussed how to regain momentum. The strategy had always been to win by appealing to moderates and working-class Democrats, but now that base was splintering. Gabbard's win had cut to the heart of the issue. Many voters felt Kamala's record as a prosecutor was not consistent with the change they had been promised. It was clear that Kamala had lost some of her luster. She wasn't just fighting Tulsi Gabbard anymore, she was fighting against the disillusionment that was growing among voters who felt betrayed by the promises of reform that never materialized. And Tulsi, with her relentless attacks on the establishment, was capitalizing on this. Kamala took a hard look at the Iowa results. The narrow win for Tulsi wasn't just a victory, it was a statement. The voters were not just rejecting Kamala's past, they were embracing Tulsi's message of disruption. Kamala's campaign manager, Janet Fields, was blunt when she spoke to her. "Kamala, we need to change our approach. The people want something real. They want to hear a clear vision for how we change the system, not just defend it." Kamala, who had always prided herself on being a pragmatic leader, was faced with an existential question: could she reinvent herself at this stage of the race? Could she abandon the system that had propelled her to the top, or would she stick to her tried-and-true approach? Meanwhile, Tulsi was on the campaign trail, pressing forward with even more intensity. Her victory in Iowa had turned heads, but it wasn't enough. She knew that this race was about more than one win, it was about shifting the entire conversation within the Democratic Party. Her victory speech after Iowa had been simple but powerful. "This isn't just my victory, it's a victory for the millions of Americans who feel forgotten by the political elite. We're not going to accept the same old politics anymore. We deserve leaders who understand that real change isn't about compromising with the system, it's about dismantling it and building something better in its place." Her words had resonated. The press had covered the speech extensively, and her call for a political revolution was starting to gain even more traction. By now, Tulsi's supporters were more than just fans, they were activists, volunteers, and organizers who had embraced her vision of real, systemic change. The primary season was rapidly approaching, and Tulsi's camp was already preparing for the next stage. They knew the momentum was on their side, but there were still obstacles ahead. Kamala Harris had deep pockets, a seasoned campaign machine, and significant institutional support. But for the first time, it felt as though the race was wide open. Tulsi's base was energized, and her message of reform was striking a chord with voters tired of the status quo. As the media buzzed with speculation about the next state primaries, Kamala Harris made a crucial decision: she would pivot to a new message. She would embrace the calls for reform, for change, and try to reframe her legacy as one of growth and evolution. But Tulsi wasn't backing down. She had spent her entire political career standing firm in her convictions, and this was her moment to prove that real change could come from the outside, not from the inside of a broken system. The next primary battle, Nevada, loomed large. It would be a test of whether Kamala Harris could reinvigorate her campaign or if Tulsi Gabbard's momentum was unstoppable. The Nevada primary was upon them, and the pressure on Kamala Harris had never been greater. After her disastrous showing in Iowa, her campaign had pivoted dramatically. She was no longer just the pragmatic former prosecutor, she had embraced a new, more progressive tone. Harris had publicly apologized for past policies, now calling for comprehensive criminal justice reform, expanded healthcare, and a re-evaluation of the nation's foreign policy. But the damage had been done. The people who had once rallied around her as the future of the Democratic Party were now questioning whether she could truly change. Could she be trusted to lead a movement of reform, or was she just another politician playing to the crowd? Tulsi Gabbard had positioned herself as the alternative, an outsider who was unafraid to challenge the establishment, even if it meant alienating powerful allies. In the days leading up to Nevada, Tulsi's campaign was everywhere. From packed rallies to viral social media posts, her message of systemic change was resonating. Tulsi wasn't just running against Kamala, she was running against the entire system that had failed too many people for too long. Her speeches were a direct challenge to everything that Kamala had stood for in her political career. On the night of the Nevada caucus, the results were undeniable. As the votes were tallied, Tulsi Gabbard had won a decisive victory. The momentum that had started with Iowa had now carried her to a significant triumph. Kamala Harris, despite her best efforts to reframe her record, had fallen short once again. The media, the pundits, and the voters all had one thing to say: Tulsi Gabbard was the future of the Democratic Party. Kamala's concession speech was somber. She had made a valiant attempt to hold on to power, but the message was clear: people were looking for something different. Kamala acknowledged her loss with grace, but there was no denying the sense of defeat in her voice. "The people have spoken," Kamala said, her voice tinged with frustration. "I've given everything to this fight, and while I may not be their choice, I believe we must continue to push for justice and progress. I wish Tulsi the best in this race. The future of this party is at stake, and I hope that we can all continue working together for a better America." Tulsi, on the other hand, was elated. She stood before her supporters, a symbol of defiance against the political establishment. The win in Nevada cemented her place as a legitimate contender for the Democratic nomination, and the battle was now hers to lose. Her victory speech was everything her supporters had come to expect: bold, unapologetic, and fiercely committed to real change. Tonight, the people of Nevada have made it clear. They are tired of the same old politics, tired of leaders who promise change but deliver the status quo. This is a movement for the forgotten. This is a movement for the people who have been left behind by a broken system. Her words echoed through the crowd, and the roar of applause was deafening. Tulsi's supporters, people from all walks of life, had gathered to see her take on the establishment, and they believed in her vision for a better future. The road to the Democratic nomination was now wide open for her. It was clear that she had become the face of a political revolution that was sweeping across the country. In the days that followed, the political pundits scrambled to assess the implications of her victory. Some still doubted her ability to go all the way, but many others saw Tulsi as the inevitable choice for those who wanted a break from the cycle of establishment politics. The final showdown was fast approaching. With the momentum firmly on her side, Tulsi knew the battle was only beginning. She was up against the entire Democratic Party establishment, but that only fueled her resolve. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for a movement that demanded a new direction for America. In the end, it wasn't just a victory for Tulsi Gabbard, it was a victory for every voter who was fed up with the old ways of doing things. The future of the Democratic Party was now in the hands of those who wanted real change. And with Tulsi Gabbard at the helm, that change was no longer a distant dream, it was a palpable reality.